Introducing The Water Hour, the show that dives deep into the critical role of water in shaping the South African economy and society. South Africa's water crisis has deepened in 2024, with over 30% of water systems in a critical state. Issues like significant leaks, vandalism, and a lack of accurate water data have worsened inefficiencies. Despite efforts to allocate funding, challenges in governance, and municipal debt undermine progress. As the summer season increases demand, solutions like watershedding, while necessary, remain unsustainable in the long term. Public-private collaborations and innovative technologies are vital to mitigating the crisis and paving the way for water resilience. Don't go away. We'll be right back with the Water Hour. Welcome to the Water Hour, the show that dives deep into the critical role of water in shaping our society and economy. Don't miss out on our insights and updates on water-related issues. Join us as we explore the work of the South African Water Chamber, only on the Water Hour. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Water Hour. In today's show, we'll take a look at the state of South Africa's water landscape in 2024. Together with our leading experts from the South African Water Chamber, we'll reflect on the progress made, tackle pressing challenges made, such as infrastructure deficits and governance inefficiencies. We'll also explore innovative solutions like AI-driven water management. We'll dive into the importance of public-private partnerships, community resilience, and how we can all contribute to a water-secure future. Most importantly, we'll discuss what steps are needed in 2025 to ensure that South Africa is better prepared to navigate its water challenges. So stay tuned as we bring together our leaders to share insight, inspire action, and craft a roadmap for sustainable water management in South Africa. This live stream is brought to you by BeLive Media and the South African Water Chamber. I invite you, the audience, to please post your comments, whether you're watching this broadcast live or you're watching it on the replay. Our panel today comprises of Dr. Anthony Turton, Benoit Leroy, Professor Haman Kassan, and also Fred Platt. So let's welcome them, shall we? Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the Water Hour broadcast for today. Glad to have you join us.
Morning, Bridget.
Morning, everybody.
Morning. So I'm going to start off our discussion with a question to each one of you. And I'm going to start with you, Benoit. So this question is to each one of you, and if you could individually answer, please. How would you summarize? So next, I would like to have Dr. Anthony Turton, and then Professor Kassan, and then Fred, if you can answer in that order, please. So how would you summarize South Africa's water landscape in 2024?
So, firstly, we forgot to say the show is not for sensitive viewers because we got facts, truth, inconvenient truth, and I think this year for me was very clearly the rude awakening. We've had talk shops for 30 years, and I'm always lamenting that we're not having the workshops and we're not implementing stuff. So this year there's no more denial that we're in a crisis and that there are solutions to the crisis. We also have embarked on over 114 billion rands worth of bulk work, excluding Rand Water's work, in the country. But the stark reality is that local government is failing outside of the Western Cape predominantly, and this is going to have to be the focus. So there's no more talking about we don't have a problem, there's no crisis, there's no catastrophe. This year we've gotten over it. we've sorted that part out. So to me, next year is going to be quite important because now we have to start doing things because talk's cheap. But at least we're not in denial anymore. So yeah, it's rude awakening, and I'm looking forward to implementing the solutions. It's really exciting stuff, and it's good for the economy.
Awesome. Anthony, how would you just summarize South Africa's water landscape for 2024?
Right, I think it's a mixed bag. I think on the good news side, we've seen the reinstatement of the blue and green drop reporting standard. So we must shout out there to Dr. Sean Phillips and his team that took some bravery to do that. But it's also shown us just how bad things are. And of course, on top of that we now know for an absolute fact that 5 of our metros are facing localized day zero crises. That's Johannesburg, Pretoria, Ekurhuleni, eThekwini, and Port Elizabeth. These are the 5 metros that are in dire straits. That they're all metros that also have a lot of industrial activity in them. So this is the year that the wheels started to fall off, and I believe that 2025 is going to be really make or break. I don't want to sound dramatic about it, but I think we have a very real chance of seeing systemic failure within those 5 metros within the next year or so.
Awesome. Thank you for your summary. Hamant, how would you summarize South Africa's water landscape for 2024?
Not good at all. I would say it's a real crisis that we're sitting with. I think there's a realization that this problem is not going to go away in a hurry. We need to understand that this problem didn't emerge last week, last month, or last year. It's as a consequence of what we did, or perhaps what we didn't do over many, many years, that we now find ourselves in this challenging situation. I think that it's well known that the amount of dissent in terms of people not receiving water and amount of protests that are happening this year has been unprecedented. If you speak to people who have not received water for a few days, some areas much longer, the frustration is there. The expectation is that this needs to be sorted out, and this needs to be fixed fast. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your summary there. And now if I could please move on to Fred, how would you summarize South Africa's water landscape for 2024?
Well, I think my colleagues have highlighted the severe problems that we face as a water sector in terms of water security. I think the most important move for me has been the realization or the acceptance, and I think if you look at the press on a daily basis, people are finally starting to understand the fact that we have a crisis, and also I think the understanding that there's a need for private and public sector participation, or working together to finding these solutions, and also the need to embrace private capital and private skills into the sector in order to start addressing the issue. The problem, however, is the speed at which I think we get to implementation as opposed to realization.
Thanks very much for that, Fred. Now, if we can go in the same order again, starting with you, Benoit, what would you say for 2024 was a notable achievement, and what would you feel was the biggest disappointment for the year in the water sector?
So thanks, Brigitte. I'll couple the 2 disappointments because there's 2 really big ones, and just to add to before that on the metros, in actual fact, 7 of the 8 have collapsed water-wise. So Mangaung, Buffalo City, exactly the same. It's only Cape Town that is not showing any signs of duress when it comes to water security. And the NIP 2050 talks about resolving the 8 metros to a standard, and that recipe can be used in the rest of the country. The 2 things that it really revolves around the metros is the collapse of eThekwini and Joburg water. So eThekwini threw the town in, and in April this year issued an expression of interest to outsource all of its existing water and sanitation infrastructure and services. Okay, so that is really a capitulation of its mandate, and not necessarily talking triple Ps. We're talking private sector participation. Triple Ps tend to be a little bit onerous, and we don't have time for that. That's 4 years away if we start today. So private sector participation is going to be the hybrid towards maybe eventually triple Ps. So eThekwini throwing the towel in was quite a shocker, because we haven't seen this in 30 years. Okay, before that is really academic. The other one is really city, Joburg, and there's a map that was done recently, and it really talks about parts of the country that have had more than 2 weeks of outages in any month, and Joburg tops the metros by far. And in actual fact, Joburg has stopped blaming. It has stopped pointing fingers. It has, except at the consumer, but we're working on that one. But Joburg, in actual fact, has admitted that it has failed and is failing in its mandate. And what it's done, to me, the highlight is, so eThekwini reaching out to the private sector. How they reach out is a different story. But Joburg is also doing that. And the price tag this week that was placed on the 3 Gauteng metros alone is 280 billion. So the 900 billion master plan, we always said was closer to 1.5 trillion. In actual fact, we're getting to between 2 and 3 trillion. Multiply that by 4, it's a hell of an economic opportunity. So that's really the good news. So we've got these, the way we sort out eThekwini and the way we sort out the Gauteng metros. So Ekurhuleni is fine. I'm there. We haven't had outages in general, and we don't have water shedding. Tshwane is a disaster, and Joburg is the big disaster because it has 6.5 million people. People are not sure about that. But to me, sorting out Gauteng and eThekwini will go a long way, but we're really talking in excess of R500 billion just for those four metros, and it's how we do it. And I think that's where the challenge lies. Is we know the problems now, but the challenge is how we put it together. And unfortunately, that is a chasm we've got to overcome now. Is national government is starting to get its act together, but local government hasn't. It's completely decrepit and dysfunctional. And how we sort that out is we have to do it. We can't survive without water. And that to me is going to be the difficult, but it's also going to, unfortunately in wars, a lot of technologies get developed and get commercialized. This is a war, and technology is going to be key for us going forward. And the nice thing is all available. So so I think we're going to have an exciting time. So the bad news is fine. We've got good news to top it. We just have to push forward, and society has to do that. We've been very lazy for 30 years, so it's up to us to push to do it. Otherwise, it won't happen.
Okay,
Thanks very much for your perspective.
Yeah.
Anthony, over to you.
Okay, for me, the high point of the year was the leadership shown by Dr. Sean Phillips and his executive team at the Department of Water and Sanitation when they launched the Partnership for a Water Secure Gauteng, the PWSG, followed immediately or shortly thereafter by a similar platform for eThekwini. So that is an admission that situation's dire. It's an admission that day zero is a reality in those metros. And I think we need to really reach out and shout out to that team and congratulate them, because it took a lot of political courage to do that. The enormous pressure to be brought to bear the people that make those sort of statements. But nonetheless, shout out to Dr. Phillips and his team. When you are a substance abuser, and the first thing you do is you admit that you're a substance abuser, that's when your healing process begins. So that's what's happened in South Africa. Our big disappointment is, I'm afraid I've got to say, is in the Western Cape. The Western Cape, in my view, has got a huge amount of potential. But the way that they are dealing with their sewage crisis, and in particular the way they are mismanaging the public trust deficit, I think is absolutely scandalous. And we see it happening in Cape Town, but we see it happening in different parts of the Cape as well. And I'm speaking now specifically about the Hermanus area, where there's also a festering sore going on. It's also about a massive loss of public trust and a huge chasm between the municipal officials that say one thing, and then the informed, enlightened public, on the other hand, that doesn't believe a word that's being said, and the two parties just simply cannot get down and talk to each other. And they burnt the boats or the bridges both ways. They can't reach out to each other. And I think that widening trust deficit from a place that has got so much incredible potential, I think that is my biggest disappointment of the year. Back to you.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Hamad, over to you. Biggest disappointment and notable achievement in your perspective?
Thanks, Brigitte. Yeah, I think that the realization that we are in a situation of crisis is, if I can use, I call that an achievement, is an acceptance of the fact that the situation is untenable, which has not previously been accepted, that it was a crisis. So I think that's an achievement, and in the first instance, for us to come to that realization, or for leadership and government to come to that realization. For me, I guess the disappointment is that having come to that realization, the public would expect that we would get fast into fixing and overcoming some of these challenges with speed. I don't know that is happening, to the extent that the public confidence and trust is there, that despite us realizing that we are in a situation of a crisis, are we doing what we have to do fast enough in order to inspire confidence of the public that the situation will be brought under control in a relatively quick period, is where my concern lies. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. And Fred, over to you, please. We have a bit of a sound issue. If you could just adjust your microphone, please.
Sorry. So for me, I think everybody else has already raised the key issue. The biggest positive is that there is a heightened awareness, there's an understanding, there's an acceptance that we have a crisis. And I think the reality is that, what is. There's no time or, value in us spending a hell of a lot of time around the fact that we are in a crisis. We are. And to get to Hamad's point, I think the biggest disappointment is that the speed with which we're addressing it. I think when we understand, and Benoit referred to it as war, when we understand the level of crisis that we're currently dealing with, the potential impact on the economy, the potential impact on social cohesion, and the potential impact on the livelihoods of the most marginalized, then I think we should be spending a bit more time in execution and a little less time in talking. So the key for me, or the disappointment for me, is that we should really, as a country, not be going on leave this December. We should not be doing anything else but saying, how do we address the water problem and how do we start tomorrow?
Thank you very much for that, Fred. Much appreciated. So my next question to all of you is, why is water sustainability so critical, not only just for economic growth in South Africa, but also for social stability? And again, Benoit, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, I've collected it. Thanks.
Yeah, there's this talk about a human right. You have to have access to water, to food, and dignity. The world doesn't really care. 2 billion people don't have access to clean water and to reasonable sanitation. And that's an overpopulation issue that we're just unable to address. So if you put that aside, if you really look at it, energy, we've got a global crisis because of the CO2 emissions, and it relates to energy generated with fossil fuels. And there are technical solutions, there are policy solutions. The political solutions aren't really making much progress at the moment. And what's happening, it's generated in the northern hemisphere, but it's hitting the southern hemisphere, which is the poor hemisphere. And but there are alternatives to the energy, and there's multiple alternatives, of which one of which is green hydrogen with water as a feedstock. With water, there's no alternative. There's alternative sources, and the planet's covered with 70% of water. So, and the technology is well commercialized. It's by far the cheapest water, generally speaking, etc. So, we have, there's no real excuse for it. And I think in the South African context is that, we've ignored water for 30 years in general. It wasn't intentional. We just tried to do other things, and we didn't listen to the scientists, the engineers, the town planners, and business. And what's happened is we've realized that there's no alternative to water. So, Clover closed their doors because electricity, they overcame that, but then the water they couldn't overcome. They closed the Northwest, biggest cheese factory in southern Africa. Okay, and everybody lost their jobs. The town collapsed. It's just a pothole, the town now. So that's a typical example of where not only do we need water, we need security of supply, and at a reasonable price, but also at a reasonable volume and at a reasonable quality. So we're all talking volume, but the quality is the next crisis that we have, and we mustn't forget that. So water, since the Industrial Revolution, yes, we used coal to generate power and drive locomotives and all this. But what's happened is we figured out, if we do like the Romans did 1800 years before, bring clean water into the towns and take the dirty water out, all of a sudden we went from 30 to 60, eventually to 80 years life expectancy in a mature economy. That's why water is, it's important. It's fundamental to everything. If you've got water, you'll be able to have food security and all this, because of our potable water, of our water that's used, non-sea water that's used in the world, 93 to 94% is in the food value chain. So it's really important. Nothing happens, without water, and it's H2O. That's it. So it's fundamental to any human life and dignity. But it's more than just access to it. It's the right price, quality, and volume. So to me, without water, there's just there's no life. Unfortunately.
Thanks, Benoit. Anthony, over to you.
Yes, I'm surprised that we're even discussing this, to be honest with you, because we all know that water is the foundation of everything. It's not only the foundation of our daily well-being, it's the foundation of a national economy, the foundation of food security. With a country unable to feed its own people and employ its own people, well, it's going on a road to nowhere. I don't know if you are able to edit this video at all before it gets flighted or after it gets flighted, but I've recently published on my Facebook page a map of a world map of water scarcity, and if you can somehow bring that in, if it's all possible. If you look at that map of world scarcity, you'll see that South Africa is an extremely water scarce country, but it's not the worst. The worst is, in fact, Australia. And Australia is, if you look at that map, it's, you just want to slash your wrists. And then you look at what the Australians are doing about their water scarcity. They're no longer a water-constrained economy. On the contrary, they're a water-abundant economy. Why? Because they've realized that they can't rely on rainfall. They've realized they can't rely on rivers. They've realized that they have to rely on technology for recovering water from waste and for removing nasty stuff from the water, either salt water from the sea or pathogens or whatever from wastewater. So the Australians have done it, and there are over 200 desalination plants in Australia. And Australia has got a thriving economy, despite the fact that it's fundamentally water constrained. So, this is the realization. Your economy does not have to suffer from the debilitating impact of water insecurity, provided you have made the necessary decisions that enable the necessary processes and attract the necessary capital. You cannot attract capital into an economy that has got socialist policies. It just doesn't work. You cannot attract capital into there we are. There we have it. You cannot attract capital into an economy where the politics of the country views that capital as the enemy. So these are the fundamental constraints. We are not actually a water constrained economy. Just look at that map there. It's it's quite remarkable. I'll be giving a talk in the next couple of weeks in the Australian water sector, talking about this exact thing, about the fact that the Australians are fast emerging as highly innovative people in the water management space, managed aquifer recharge and recovery of water from waste, desalination of seawater, etc. It's just an amazing place, because the politics and the policies are enabling of capital and technology to find solutions. And that's the trick. How do we create an enabling environment for capital to come in, to be supported by technology in order to solve the problems? Government cannot solve these problems alone. The government can only do two things. They can regulate and they can incentivize. Nothing more, nothing less. So they can regulate what's done and they can incentivize what needs to be done. Nothing more than that. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that summary. And over to you, Professor Kassan. What would you say, why is water sustainability so critical to South Africa, not just for economic growth, but also for social stability?
Thanks, Brigitte. Look, let's talk about the fundamental human right that is established in the Constitution here, particularly in South Africa, for the need for provision of water for people. Now, if we are serious that the need for people to have water is a fundamental human right, then we have to put in the appropriate steps and processes to ensure that the water management system and water security is fully intact on a sustainable basis going forward. Unfortunately, that is not the reality. The reality is far from that. And we've seen many examples of that, from where I'm sitting, I don't believe that we have a water availability problem. There is no water availability problem in South Africa. There is a water management problem. Now, you have to understand that as the consumer and customer receiving water, you have an expectation that utilities, governments, municipalities would undertake the fundamental responsibility of ensuring that you receive this on an ongoing, sustainable basis at the best price, 24 hours a day, at the best quality. So that is exactly where the system has failed. Now, having understood that system has failed and fundamentally failed at the level of the municipal level, that level has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed very quickly. Now, we can interrogate how the system failed, why it failed, etc., but I think that that's all history. It has now to be tackled at high speed, and it has to be fixed. The question is, are those folks capable of fixing it? Well, one view is that the best and the fastest way to move ahead now to ensure that people have this fundamental human right to water is to bring in the private sector and to have a public-private sector partnership in order to speed up, given that the skills, capability, leadership, etc., can be brought in with the private sector in order for us to solve this problem. So at the end of the day, I want to agree with my colleagues that the importance of it cannot be overemphasized. Many reasons: economic, the importance in respect of production, the fact that it's a fundamental human right, the fact that less people are receiving water now than were receiving in the past in the same country. I think that alone tells you that we are sitting in a serious crisis here, which needs very serious attention, and it cannot be left to those folks who created the crisis. You need a different form of thinking to emerge from this problem in a victorious way. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your summary there, Hamant. And Fred, if we can move over to you, please, your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I find it quite interesting that we generally accept Maslow's need hierarchy as a foundation for understanding human motivation and behavior. But then we don't understand that the foundation of social cohesion is the provision of basic services like water. And we've spoken about, what that is all for, food production, etc., etc. But the reality of the matter is we can't start building a nation. We can't start building a common vision. We can't start building an economy that attracts capital, as Tony has spoken about. We can't do any of that if water security is not the foundation upon which we build our social structures and our economy. So the consequences of water security is that water becomes the economic enabler and allows for the attraction of capital and the creation of wealth and the creation of jobs and participation of the private sector, etc., etc. But the absence of water has two very severe consequences. One is the lack of social cohesion and the risk associated with that, and the other one is that instead of being an economic enabler, it becomes an economic disabler. And so, water at the end of the day should be the absolute cornerstone of our economic and social policies for the country.
Thanks very much for that, Fred. And we're going to stay with you for a moment, if you don't mind. Now, South Africa's invested about 54 billion in water infrastructure in 2024, but the need over the next decade is about 900 billion. What would you say are some of the biggest obstacles to bridging this gap?
So, I think the important thing to understand is that that 900 billion is probably a very conservative number, as Benoit has mentioned. We know that the fiscus is unable to provide that, and it's a widely accepted fact that we need private capital to invest into the sector in order to redress and to create the water security that we require. In my opinion, if we had to boil all of it down, it really boils down to two issues. The one being a lack of capacity. That's a capacity to bring projects to bankable feasibility, to manage projects, etc., etc. And on the other end, it's a lack of trust or a lack of governance. And so those two issues are, in my opinion, the biggest inhibitors. And when I talk about capacity, I'm also talking about turning kind of projects or concepts into action or into actionable projects. So the two issues, as I said, one is a lack of capacity, the other one is a lack of trust or governance. And we have a massive backlog which spans all of the municipalities, many of them in rural areas, etc., which makes it very, very difficult. It's not something that we can, in the traditional way, address the lack of capacity or the lack of governance across the country. If we had to look at building capacity in the traditional way and recruiting the right people and rebuilding the structures and re-establishing those governance forum, etc., it'll take forever, and we just don't have the time. And that's where the use of technology, the digital or digitalization of water infrastructure, the application of smart analytics, AI, and machine learning, and ultimately governance frameworks such as distributed ledger, blockchain, and the tokenization of water become critical in enabling private capital and into the areas, and also to use the technology to identify the quickest and most effective projects that need to be implemented, using the Pareto principle, we need to say, where do we spend 20% of our money to get 80% of the return, and where do we do it the quickest? And that is it, through the application and the use of big data, and cooperation between the public and the private sector.
Fred, if you don't mind, just another question for you, and then we'll move on to Benoit. Fred, in your opinion, how can our leadership in governance and business collaborate to reduce the inefficiencies that we currently have in infrastructure development? Because that's quite a hot topic.
It is. And I think if we deal historically, and I think Tony spoke earlier about the fact that very often capital is seen as the enemy of the state, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a need for a common point of truth, or a central point of truth that everyone can agree on. There's a need for structures that allow everyone to engage within their areas that they're comfortable with and they understand. Very often it comes down to lexicon. It comes down to historical, ideological positions, etc., etc. And those we speak about the three tiers of engineering. We need the hard engineering, and that we're pretty good at. We can specify a job, we can work on what is required, we can get the engineers down, and that's not the problem. We do that all the time. Even technology is not the problem. I think the key is, how do we fund these projects, and how do we manage the stakeholder engineering? And that really comes down to creating a structure where we can use technology, use smart contracting, use distributed ledger or blockchain as a common point of truth with data, in order to create the trust that allows these different people to start understanding that they're not competing with each other, but that they are absolutely dependent on the success of the other. Tony spoke about government and the role of government in creating policy and in regulating and incentivizing, and private capital in terms of the actual implementation and funding, etc., etc. And when you start understanding that together, that puzzle comes together in a way that can create sustainability for our economy and actually protects everyone, including government, including business, and including the average citizen, then we can move this process forward.
Thanks very much for your input, Fred. And Benoit, now over to you. With your extensive experience in private-public partnerships, how do you think can the private sector contribute to upgrading South Africa's deteriorating water infrastructure?
So firstly, our architecture is being changed. So we can't have a national water infrastructure owner of the dams, etc., a water board, and then a utility or municipality distributes it. We need source to tap. So because local municipalities are defunct in reality, and they're getting worse, not better, and it's recognized by national government that has to change. So there are two pilots taking place in Gauteng and in KZN, where special purpose vehicles being set up. There's massive international DFIs, development finance institutions involved, and local treasury. And the idea is based on the resource to tap principle, is that one invoice gets generated with the use of water. And instead of the 30 billion to 40 billion that's owed to the various entities at the moment, which could collapse all the water boards and Department of Water Sanitation, water trading entity for selling bulk water, but it's not paid for. So those SPVs, what they do is they ring fence the invoicing. So the revenues are then ring fenced, and they're used not by the council, they're used by the SPV for water-related infrastructure rejuvenation, augmentation, and paying the national water trading entity. So that's an acceptance that local government's role in water will disappear. It's a constitutional issue, and that Copter cannot win. It can't, because the will of the people is to have water. So that's fundamental. And what will happen is, if there's a bit of kickback, there's been massive threats by Treasury to put the metros under administration. And that's been very well publicized also. So they're going to toe the line. What this means is jobs for pals and for votes is gone. Okay, people don't realize it, but it's actually gone. So the Department of Water and Sanitation National is actually, the legislation hasn't been passed to my knowledge, but it was approved by all stakeholders before the national elections, where water service providers have to be licensed, and national government and local government won't qualify for those licenses, and that license will go to the SPVs, which will be a combination of national, provincial, local governments with private sector funding, DFIs, and all this. So in essence, the role of water will become, like it is in the rest of the world, most of the world, it becomes a utility where local stakeholders have an interest, a commercial interest, but also you have one supply chain, and it takes out all of the issues. And this can be done a lot quicker than doing triple Ps. So it's private sector participation as opposed to triple Ps. And in actual fact, the two were supposed to be launched before the end of October. There's been some delays there, but there's some really big funding going into them, by international DFIs. That's actually the solution. So we'll see that happening in the metros, and there will be pushback. People don't like change, but you need water. But that's really what's going to happen. And the triple P train is in actual fact, I think it's expired as a concept for the water sector in South Africa. Anyway, we might see some hybrids, but the SPV model is where it's going. You're on mute, Pujetti.
Thanks for that heads up. Benoit, thank you for that summary. I've got one more hot potato question for you, and then we'll move over to Dr. Anthony Turton. Vandalism and aging infrastructure compound the challenges that we see in water. What would you say, or what would you suggest as a solution to mitigate these two burning issues?
So they're driven by two different things. So the aging infrastructure is a global situation. So we see non-revenue water is very high in the newer economies that were built after the Second World War and then not maintained. So it's a global issue, but it's being raised at United Nations for the first time, and it's a top priority in the world. We have to reduce those inefficiencies. The vandalism is a purely economic thing. And until South Africa's economy is sorted out, the vandalism will just increase. So the rule of law can only really be enforced once you've got a thriving economy, because it costs money to do that. And so that's not a water issue. That's opportunism, gangsterism, mafia-like things, etc. Italy went through it in the 60s and 70s and eventually managed to kill it down. But you have to have a thriving economy to do that. So we will address, through the SPV models, we'll address the aging infrastructure over time. It's going to be a 10, 20, 30-year process. It's not a 5 or 2 year or 3 year process. Getting the economy going again is actually quite easy. One just has to stop thinking communism and socialism and all these things. Just keep it in the center and attract capital. So once we start on the water infrastructure rejuvenation through the SPVs and the likes, is capital will start flowing, and that will spread across. And we're seeing it in energy. A lot of capital's flowing in, but it's in the private space, not into the Eskom space. People are self-sufficient. Water, it's a little bit different. So I think as we enter into those sort of phases, the vandalism and the poverty, etc., will start being addressed and alleviated by a better economy. When people have got work, they don't vandalize. And, half the people don't have work. So we need to give them work, and dignified work. Shovels and all this is not work. It has to be dignified work and efficient work. So, so in the water sector, we can't do much. We can just get it going, and hopefully it will solve the other symptoms that we have of general poverty and lawlessness.
Thanks very much. And if we could move over to you now, Anthony, how significant would you say Is municipal debt in exacerbating water service inefficiencies? And what policy solutions would you advocate to address this issue?
Municipal debt is an existential threat to the very survival of the South African government. Simple as that. It's a poison chalice. If it is not addressed, then the government will be unable to govern. Therefore, I believe that this municipal debt issue is a national security crisis. And I don't mince my words when I say that at all. If we look at the impact on the various water boards, almost all of the water boards are in financial distress simply because of this municipal debt thing. And then we ask, why is the municipal debt like that? And we get to a very simple thing. The Constitution, the cooperative governance clause in the Constitution has said that it is not legally possible for one branch of government to interfere in the activities of another. One tier or one sphere of government may not work outside of its domain. So that, I would say, is illogical, it is irrational, and therefore I would say that ultimately it does not belong in the Constitution. And unless and until we overcome that problem, I don't see that this crisis is going to be solved. It doesn't make sense to allow a municipality to get so far into debt that the domino effect of its financial failure now starts rippling across the economy, because that's what's happening here. So if we can make some realistic projections going forward, I think in all probability, I'm now talking probabilities, not facts. So I would say there's better than 50% probability that 2025 is going to see one or more of the major metros go into financial liquidation, going to collapse, and there's a good possibility that that's either going to be Johannesburg or eThekwini. I don't know which one's going to collapse first, but those two are teetering on the very brink of collapse. And what that's going to do now in terms of knock-on effect is quite profound. So, the question is, how has it been allowed to get so bad for so long? The answer to that is the cooperative governance clause. The regulator has been unable to regulate because a functional regulator would have picked that problem up 10, 15, 20 years ago and not allowed it to escalate into what it is today. We've tried, and members of this team here today, we've tried to bring this case through the Helen Suzman Foundation to the Constitutional Court, and no one was interested in listening to it. But that's my opinion. Until such time as that gets sorted out, the debt crisis is literally going to collapse the South African economy. And of course, while that's happening, the elites, they are still busy moving their cash offshore. They're still busy plundering and they're still busy enriching themselves. So what we're talking about is a social and political instability that is going to result in almost inevitable collapse of the national economy. Now that sounds very dire and very doom and gloomy kind of thing, and I don't want to talk like that, but that's what all of the realities of the situation point in that direction. So let's rather focus on how we've got to turn it around and what needs to be done to prevent that doom and gloom scenario from happening. But I think if I can nail my colours to the mast, 2025 is going to be the year that we're going to see the first major metro in South Africa actually losing its water security and therefore running into a de facto day zero situation, and with all the implication that will have in terms of public debt, of course, job creation and all that sort of stuff. I'll just close off by saying one other interesting thing. There's talk now that government has to downsize its labour force. I've been talking about that and writing about that for some time. A thing called the fiscal cliff. I've been writing about that for many years now. This is 100% inevitability, and it's starting to happen. And I've just learned that it's happening in, of all places, the State Security Agency, the SSA, the very entity that is responsible for the security of the state. They're now having to lay off everyone over the age of 50. Anyone over the age of 50, they must go. So in other words, your institutional capacity is going, your institutional memory is going. Those are the very, very people that I was involved in some years ago. We're training them to understand water as a national security risk. So at the very time that water becomes a national security risk, the people that should understand the implications of that are now being purged from the system because the salaries can't be paid. That's the reality.
So, just staying with you for a moment, Anthony, from a scientific and policy perspective, what are the immediate actions do you think are required to stabilize South Africa's water infrastructure? And then we'll move on to Hammonds.
I think the immediate policy situation or policy requirement is to target all messaging at the restoration of public trust. So let's call it public trust, because government doesn't recognise that investor confidence is a factor. But if we talk about public trust, if we can rebuild public trust, then in that public are investors, and then they will become confident again. So let's not use the poisoned word of investor confidence, because that's ideologically not acceptable. But we have to restore public trust as a matter of priority. If we don't store that trust as a matter of priority, I'm afraid the collapse is predictable, inevitable. We just don't know when, but we know it is going to happen. There's no question about it. So that's what I would say as a policy pronouncement, a point of departure. Stop shifting blame onto people, onto entities that are consuming too much. This narrative about we use too much water and all of that, that's blame shifting. That just angers people that are already angry. So this whole idea of rebuilding trust. How do we rebuild trust? How do we make people believe that they can go to the beach and be contaminated by sewage, and cut through all the nonsense? But there's 300 samples that have been taken, and the beaches are 30 beaches are safe because of 300 samples. Utter nonsense. Public trust is the issue, and embedded in that is investor confidence. Get it right. There's a famous saying, it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy. Get the economy going, and the rest will get sorted out.
Thanks very much. And now over to you, Hammonds. Based on your international work, what successful policies from other countries can South Africa adapt or adopt to improve its water governance?
Thanks, Brigetti. So, if I just go back one step, in the newfound democracy in our own country here in South Africa, there was some amazing work that was done in terms of the policies and legislative changes that occurred, right? So much so that South Africa was hailed as being one of the most innovative in the world. For example, one of the innovative aspects was the free basic water policy. So we have done some amazing work in terms of innovation and looking at the policy environment very early in the democracy. But our challenge has been that South Africa has failed to execute and enforce these policies. I mean, it has long been established as a principle that the polluter pays. But as has been mentioned by Anthony just a little earlier, right, we did not enforce those policies to protect the ecosystems and the environment, right? Just like we did not enforce policies around ensuring that we didn't create all of this debt within the municipalities and some of the other public institutions. So all of that was controllable. So if I answer your question, yes, there may be some examples across the world that we could still take on and improve, but I don't think that our challenge is largely in that environment. Another area where we do have a challenge is we don't have an independent water regulator. Government is the regulator. That means it's the player and the referee. Now, here's an area where much research has been done, and the global view demonstrates that regulation should be independent. So South Africa has been very, very slow to adopt this notion of having an independent regulator in place, which we have, for example, in the form of NERSA for electricity. One like this is needed for water, to protect the public interest, to ensure that this public trust and confidence is there from the water suppliers, etc. In terms of governance now, your second question related to policies around governance. Governance is a very simple issue from my experience across the world. Firstly, you need to ensure that you have political will. Political will is key and interweaved with proper governance. Without political will, water and sanitation will never change in any country from the experience that has been demonstrated across the world. If there's strong political will, if there is a conscientization and realization that we're in a crisis, that's step one. Number two, you need the right expertise. All of your agencies, boards, structures, etc., must have the right expertise and skills. Without this, you cannot have the right level of governance. Thirdly, the experience overseas shows that we should detract from having any political interference, because you will not be able to attract the right expertise if you continuously have political interference. Experts in the field are not going to be entertaining you to be serving on these boards and to be doing what they believe is in the right interest of the public good and the good of the country if there's continuous political interference. And then the rest is all about leadership and management and holding accountability and having transparency. So I think that this is easily put into place if there's the right political will. Coming back to your issue of policies, I think we need to get very strong on execution. However, in some cases, the bull has already bolted. For example, the debt. The issue of debt, the bull has long bolted. When you look at the issue of pollution, these days I see there's more and more legal cases and there's more and more fines that are happening, which is a good thing. But what damage have we already caused in the last 20 years? So we need to move at speed to ameliorate some of these damages and bring back the notion of confidence in the public supply of water and sanitation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your input there. Another question for you, though, if we can stay with you for another minute. How can South Africa's research institutions contribute to long-term water sustainability solutions?
So who's this one for? May I take this, Brigitte?
Yes, that is for you. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, how can South Africa's research institutions contribute to long-term water sustainability solutions? They have a huge role to play. On the one hand, I'd like to believe that they should focus on research for impact. In other words, that the research funding should be prioritized towards development, adaptation, trialing, testing of technologies that are going to improve human life. Right? That's going to improve water sustainability. That's going to improve water quality. That's going to bring down the cost of water. And that's going to increase the extent of access of water to people in this country. So the promotion of technologies is critical. The pilot testing of these technologies is critical, especially in areas of digitization. I see some great work happening in this country already, if I can say so, from agencies like the Water Research Commission. Some of the water efficient technologies, the water efficient sanitation technologies in particular, some of the non-sewage sanitation technologies which do not require the use of sewers, because we are all aware that our wastewater infrastructure is in disrepair in this country. We cannot be loading it anymore. Therefore, the notion of having non-sewage sanitation as a way of solving the problem of the sanitation challenge in the schools, which we all know about. These are the kinds of innovative solutions that South Africa needs to reduce the use of water, to recycle more water, and then to create the environment where technology uptake and adoption by utilities and municipalities is speeded up. Whilst there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of technologies locally and globally, the rate of technology uptake and adoption by the very people who are at the cutting edge of service delivery, we find globally is very slow. And that is where we need speed. We need speed of uptake for digitization, taking on the new technologies, showing the value in terms of efficiency. And these technologies in many areas have already been showing amazing value in terms of efficiency, cost reduction, the ability to manage your systems better. So the research institutions, yes, they have a huge role to play to bring these technologies to the service providers, to demonstrate to them that these are fully capable and ready to be executed and implemented in order for consumers and customers to receive the benefit of technological adoption. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now if we could move over to you, Anthony, how can AI and machine learning effectively be leveraged for water management in South Africa, or to optimize its water management?
Yeah, that's a great question. AI is a technology whose time has come. It's in our face all over the world. If you can measure it, you can manage it, and you can start projecting and creating actionable intelligence. In other words, you can start anticipating where systems are going to fail. And you remember the situation in South Africa is such right now. As I said earlier on, we are teetering on the brink of a national security crisis as the water systems fail. So if you've got an artificial intelligence system, an AI system in place, where you know how the water is flowing through the system, you know where the bottlenecks are, you know how full the reservoirs are, you know what the pressures are like at different points in the system, and you can very quickly start predicting which place is going to have a crisis in the let's say the next 30 minutes. But more importantly, you can start preempting that because you've got actionable intelligence. You can turn a pump on, you can throttle back a valve, you can do something all remotely from a central control panel. In fact, it can all be done without an operator in place. So I don't see any alternative than for South Africa, if it wishes to emerge from this crisis unscathed. I don't see any alternative but for us to start implementing these AI platforms literally from the source of water all the way to the final end user, where they discharge that water back into the environment, either into the ocean or to a river via a wastewater plant. You must remember that when you are empowered with that kind of information, you can start doing so many more things with it. It becomes an enabler in its own right. And what do I mean by that? Well, we mentioned earlier on the large sums of capital that are going to be needed to be reinvested into the water sector in South Africa. Where's that going to come from? Well, the economy's collapsed, so therefore the tax basket is empty. So it's not going to come from taxes. It's not going to come from the fiscus. But one of the things that it can come from is tradable water credits. And tradable water credits, I think, is a very, very exciting field. I'm involved in that at the moment. To me, it's almost a no-brainer. Where we've got, let's say, for argument's sake, we've got 1,000 wastewater treatment plants in South Africa. Let's say 90% of them are dysfunctioning in one way or another. So let us put a sensor or set of sensors at the input and the discharge point of every one of those 1,000 wastewater plants. Let's capture that data in real time, and then let's start measuring off a baseline and quantifying their contribution to the overall pollution load. And then from that baseline, we can start saying, if you improve it by 5%, a small improvement, a 10% improvement in efficiency, this is what it's going to mean to the rest of the system. And you can monetize that. You can create a monetary value for that, and you can then start trading those credits. Now, this is a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer. This kind of technology, I think Benoit is involved in that sort of technology. Fred is in that technology space as well. This is an absolute no-brainer. This is technology for the future. So I think that this is going to be something that's going to emerge from the current catastrophe of the failure of the South African water system. And I'm extremely optimistic that coming out of that is going to be something better. And I just want to close by saying that it's not just a question of privatizing the water sector. What you're doing is you are creating an auditable value chain so the regulator can know who's doing what in the system. So the regulator can say, but let's say there's 100 industries in an area and only 2 of them are really bad polluters. Well, if those two are bad polluters, then you can do something about those two polluters because they are harming the other 98 polluters that aren't so bad. Okay, so in other words, it's that level of detail, actionable intelligence, and that is where the world is going. So if South Africa doesn't get onto that bandwagon, it's simply going to continue to fall further and further behind in the global race for capital, in the global race to be part of an economy that's bigger than your own. Thank you.
Well said, and thanks very much for that, Anthony. And Fred, if we can now move over to you for a moment. What steps do you think the South African Water Chamber could take to help align the private sector efforts with national policy goals to fix the water sector?
So I think the important thing at this point in time is that whatever actions we do, wherever we get involved, it should be around how do we implement, what are the obstacles to implementation, and how do we move implementation forward. I think Tony has spoken about many of the technologies that are available, the enabling environment. And so I think as a water chamber, there's really two areas that are critical for us. The one is on the implementation. How do we aid and assist in unlocking the obstacles to implementation? What is required? How do we ensure that we draw off business in order to get to a situation where we can do implementation? And the second area is, we've all spoken about the debt and the municipal debt, and I think Rand Water came out today and said that it is in severe risk if the municipalities don't pay it the 7.7 billion that it owes it. But we also know that there are agreed, understood procedures for dealing with this, ring fencing the historical debt, making sure that we immediately address the current situation in order to get no worse, and then using technology, tokenization, blockchain, and governance frameworks, data, etc., to start addressing the backlog. So I think the key is for business to get involved with the water chamber, to align behind us, to create that dialogue with government, and that dialogue should really just focus on the two areas. One is, how do we ensure that we start implementing all of these wonderful plans right away, and secondly, how do we address the financial challenges, and how do we use technology in order to incentivize and to regulate and to ensure governance so that we can move the process forward.
Thanks, Fred. And Benoit, if we could now move over to you, please. Public-private partnerships have been very pivotal in addressing water crisis globally. What has worked in South Africa so far, and where can we improve?
Yeah. So traditionally, triple Ps in all sectors have been supported by sovereign guarantees. That has become an issue globally also now, and we're seeing a trend away from that. And this is where the digitalization comes in. And in South Africa, the longest triple P we've had in water is the one in eThekwini in the Southern Basin, which Veolia and a consortium with Amgani have been managing for 25 years quite successfully. So instead of discharging semi-treated sewage through the Berea there into the Indian Ocean, eThekwini didn't have the money. It had just been formed, and it went out to the private sector on a competitive basis and formed this concession to treat the sewage and sell it on to SAPREF, and that was open to Mondi and to some other industry there. But SAPREF and Mondi being especially Mondi, the high water users, so the pulp and paper mill. That was very successful. In actual fact, it was driven by national treasury because we didn't have triple P regulations at the time, and that formed the basis of future triple Ps. But we only really got 2 triple Ps since then, and they what Bywater started at the time, in Nelspruit, which was not really successful, not because of Bywater, because it was rural, and Free Water made that very difficult to be bankable. And then we've got the very successful one in Belito, which was originally called Caesar Water. Both of these being bought out from the multinationals, so from the British and the French, and are run by local investment companies. And they've been very successful. So, in Belito, there's most of the water, virtually all of it is bought from Mgani. It's a matter of distributing it, checking that the quality is correct, and boosting disinfection like chlorine, etc. And they do have a direct reuse from one of the sewage plants into the system when they had a drought 7-8 years ago, and that's been very successful. Also nearing the end. So we haven't really entered that, and the problem we have at the moment is that we can't get sovereign guarantees because of South Africa's debt, and the debt is a problem because of Eskom. So Transnet to a certain extent and other SAEs, but it's really the wage bill, and it's the guarantees that were given to Eskom, and Eskom had to give to the IPPs for 300 billion of IPP work, 290 billion, somewhere around there. Big money, but very successful program. So now we've got to do something that doesn't have sovereign guarantees. And this is where the digital toolbox comes in. So, Fred and I have been busy. We were the first to tokenize water in Australia, and Australians are adamant they're the most sophisticated water market, not by volume, but sophistication. So all indications are it's fairly true, because we were the first to tokenize water there, water trading. We're busy in the US at the moment, in Virginia, also with tokenization for water mitigation credits and all the likes. So there's definitely the ability of a digital toolbox is able to help private sector participation in the newer forms where governments really don't want to give the overt sovereign guarantees, and there's other ways of credit enhancements and the likes. So we're busy working also with the International Finance Corporation, and there's quite a good scheme as it was put up in Peru, for example. So South Africa, we can adopt all of these new things very quickly, and that's that. We did it with mobile phones. They said there's only potential for 2 million. There's over 110 million mobile phones in South Africa. There's a huge potential for digitalization, and the technology is less than a decade old, but it's really going in leaps and bounds, and it's really driven by water accountability and closing that trust deficit that all of us are talking about. And so it's quite over. South Africa found that we were only 44% ready to digitalize, and we need to be at 88%. Biggest load of bollocks I've ever heard in my life. So we're looking for an excuse not to do it. But we've got some pilot programs that are starting, and Cape Town has already embarked on that. It's using machine learning on its bulk water systems with its pressure reduction and pressure management. They save 80 to 100 megabits a day just doing that. So we are starting to get traction, but I think we're going to see during the course of next year huge adoption of digitalization in Southern Africa, not just South Africa. And that's really private sector participation, because what that does, it lays a platform for enhanced governance and makes projects bankable, and then the private sector and DFIs can come in. There is huge interest from the global DFIs, funders, private equity, and high net worth individuals. Huge interest for South Africa and for SADC. So it's there. We just have to sew it up, and that's what we're going to do next year.
Thanks very much, Benoit. Now we are running, going to run out of time soon, but I think this question, so before we move on to the closing segment, Fred, I think I've got I feel quite an important question for you, because I think to be successful, this partnership is quite crucial. So community involvement is important to curbing vandalism and fostering conservation. How can we in South Africa better mobilize communities to participate in water preservation efforts?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, there's three spheres of engineering that we believe are critical in order to be able to provide a sustainable solution to the crisis that we currently have. The hard engineering, the financial engineering, which we spent a bit of time speaking about, and then the stakeholder engineering, and that involves, at the end of the day, the dealing with the complexity of the three tiers of government, and the challenges around the supply chain processes and times. It involves the engagement with capital, but it also involves the understanding amongst the community that at the end of the day, their input, their protection, their working with the in the process is critical in ultimately providing the service to them. So it's a complex issue. It's not one that is just a little sideshow. It's a critical component of the sustainability of the entire system, and therefore in all of the actions that we're involved with, dealing and getting the community involvement, getting them to understand the infrastructure at the end of the day is critically important for their own development. I think, again, getting back to the need hierarchy, and when people start understanding, and when their basic needs are met, and they start understanding that uh, basic infrastructure allows them to prosper, allows them to grow, and allows economic activity to start is taking place, then you can start dealing with those, getting the support of those communities, getting the processes in place that ensure that we can achieve the objectives.
Thanks very much, Fred. And I believe Anthony's got a comment on the importance of community.
Yes, I think one of the most interesting and exciting ways to get community involvement and also to mobilize local capital is through the local stokvel. Every community will have a stokvel in it, and multiple stokvels in many communities. The stokvel is an investment scheme for people that do not have the necessary, like a collateral to raise a loan through the normal banking system. And the stokvels in South Africa control vast sums of capital. But more importantly, they represent let's call it a network of moral integrity that is embedded in local communities far, far better than any police force will ever be embedded. So I think that an interesting and exciting way would be to reach out to stokvella in areas where there's a high level of vandalism, get them to buy into the whole process, become shareholders, if you like, in the whole process, and then to start using that inherent integrity, that trust that they represent, to start rebuilding the fabric of society where vandalism takes place. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now we're going to do a round robin just to round off our conversation today. And I think I'd like to start with Hamant, if you don't mind. What is the single most critical action South Africa must take in 2025 to address its water crisis? And if you could give one piece of advice to our policymakers, businesses, and citizens to ensure water sustainability in the coming year, what would that be?
So yeah, you know, I would suggest that the one thing that we ought to be doing is fixing the leaks, simply because of the following. If our leakage is around 40 to 45% as a national average, that means slightly under half the amount of water is being wasted, firstly. Secondly, consumer is paying for it but not receiving it. Thirdly, many consumers in this country are not receiving water to begin with. So for me, it's a no-brainer. This country has to focus on solving the problem of water leaks fast and furiously in order to overcome the challenge. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Fred, if I can now move on to your comment, please. The single most critical action South Africa must take in 2025, and your advice for policymakers, businesses, and citizens to ensure water sustainability for 2025.
Agree 100% with Haman. You can't be putting water into a leaking bucket. It doesn't at the end of the day, that's the fundamental. Secondly, the economics work, because if you address the water If you've got 50% non-revenue water and you address that, you not only do you double the available resource, and I just want you to think about that for a moment, because that is effectively what you do. You're doubling the available resource and you're halving your input cost. So a total economic no-brainer. It's just a question of addressing the trust and the implementation capacity. And my advice is very simple. We should not be having any meeting that does not focus on implementation. I think the discussions around what should be done and what is the problem and how it arose and all of that is wonderful, but it's academic. So any engagement should be, how do we get to implementation? What are the obstacles to implementation? How do we remove the obstacles to implementation, and how do we implement? We seem to be having some technical challenges. I'm sure we'll be back soon.
Please note, this is not a position. This is not majority.
Apologies, everyone, for the technical glitch that we've experienced with the sound and the internet. So I think Fred was trying to say something, but his microphone is not working. So I think if we could round up with Benoit and ask you what is the single most critical action South Africa can take in 2025 to address the water crisis, and what advice have you got for policymakers, businesses, citizens to ensure water sustainability for the coming year?
Sure. Can you hear me,
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, yeah, from my perspective, what's really important is we need to depoliticize basic services, including water. And that includes, as Hamad said, I mean, we've been lobbying this for a very long time, independent water regulation. We need to have that. All the sectors are independently regulated. So water needs to be done. We know it's more sophisticated. Treasury did start embarking on the process, and now we see nothing. So the GNU needs to start delivering, and so I think that's important. Depoliticization and also the water regulation, because that's going to help attract capital, and then really to embrace we're not going from third to fourth, we're going from fifth to sixth industrial revolution. So embrace digitalization, which is not a silver bullet, but the most important and fastest growing. 33% was published this morning of world investment in new tech in water is in the digital toolbox, which includes AI, machine learning, tokenization, distributed ledger technology, smart analytics, etc., etc. So there's investor confidence in it, and in South Africa, I think once we've got independent regulation, we've got let's say the SPV model inculcated, and we've depoliticized the water sector to an extent. I know it's not an overnight thing. I think we're going to be making huge progress, and also community organizations on that topic. There's a lot that have mobilized that are very well funded by public companies, for example, international ones and local ones. And they are putting a lot of pressure for accountability, etc. And some of them are even using digital tools and some smart analytics and some apps on mobile devices, etc., to try and help in cleaning up, etc. So there's a lot of moving parts, and as Amantha said, is the non-revenue water is our death knell at the moment. But it's no use sorting that out if we don't sort out the pollution and the sewage pollution. We have to do both. So we have to look at quantity, the volume, but also the quality of the water, because we're poisoning our water sources. So a lot of moving parts, but I think we can do it.
Thank you so much. A great positive note to end on. So final word to you, Anthony. What is the single most critical action you believe South Africa must take for 2025, and your advice for policymakers, businesses, and citizens to ensure water sustainability?
I think the most important thing is to stop talking about or asking the question, is there a water crisis? We know there's a water crisis. It's a slow onset disaster. We are deep in it. Stop thinking about, is it going to happen? It has happened. It is not happening. It has happened. So I want to be positive in my closing off here. I think the most important thing we need to do in 2025, well, there's more than one thing. I think the first thing, we have to get serious about our sewage crisis. If we do not get on top of our sewage crisis as a matter of national priority, all the rest is going to be worthless as far as I'm concerned. So, number one, our national sewage crisis. And number two, I think we've got to start thinking very carefully about being able to forewarn, particularly around areas of social instability where services fail, particularly during a heat wave, where people start getting angry and start taking out their frustrations. In other words, the ability to call out a hotspot before it happens, and then to potentially, hopefully intervene in that hotspot to cool it down so that it doesn't become a flashpoint. Because we know in South Africa's history, I'm a former national security person. We know that once a flashpoint happens in South Africa, the sparks rapidly take flame in other parts of the country. We have to avoid that at all costs. So this machine learning AI tool that can predict that, I think, is a very, very important thing. And then finally, I'd like to just urge South Africans to really start thinking about holding the officials accountable, and particularly around this whole digitization. It's a no-brainer, absolute no-brainer. If we don't digitize in the next year, I'm afraid we're not going to have a good future going forward. So I hope this is not quite as positive as I would like to wrap it up on, but this is a realistic conclusion that I've drawn after our conversation today. Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you very much to all our panelists today. As we wrap up the discussion, it's clear that South Africa's water challenges are both urgent and complex. However, the insights shared by our panelists have highlighted the opportunities that we have to drive meaningful change, from investing in infrastructure and leveraging innovative technologies to fostering private and public partnerships and community involvement. We hope today's conversation inspires action, whether you are a policymaker, business leader, or citizen. We all have a role to play. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay committed to making a difference.
No evidence at all.